A luxurious estate under strict quarantine. No one allowed in, no one allowed out. Yet in this sealed silence, a deadly secret thrived, and one of them killed to protect it. But Hercule Poirot believes, in isolation, lies can echo louder, and a murderer cannot hide behind locked doors forever. Wychwood Under Ashe nestled in the English countryside, its thatched cottages and cobblestone lanes glowing in the autumn light of 1930, for the village green framed by fiery oaks exuded rustic charm, yet an eerie stillness gripped the air. St. Mary's grey spire pierced the mist, and a brook murmured past shuttered shops, their half-timbered fronts timeless. Beneath the idyllic scene unease simmered, marked by silence, and Wood's Hercule Poirot arrived. His Morris 8 halting at the green's edge, he stepped out, shoes shining, mustache twitching, eyeing the quiet. Poirot had come to Wychwood Under Ashe seeking respite. London's clamor had worn upon him after a particularly taxing case, and a friend, Captain Hastings, no less, had sung the praises of this rural haven, a little paradise. Hastings had called it, extolling its peaceful lanes and unspoiled beauty. Poirot, ever fastidious, had envisioned a retreat of order and calm, a chance to restore his nerves amid the simplicity of the English countryside. Yet as he stood there, the fog curling about his ankles, he sensed that fate had other designs. His destination lay ahead, the Rose and Crown, in a sturdy building of dark beams and mullioned windows that presided over the village's western fringe. As he approached, the door swung open, and Mrs. Edith Fletcher, the inn's widowed mistress, greeted him with a smile that masked a flicker of unease. Her eyes, keen and searching, met his own. "Monsieur Poirot, I presume," she said, her voice warm but edged with strain. "Welcome to Wychwood Under Ashe. I trust the journey was kind." "Oui, madam," Poirot replied, bowing slightly. "The journey, it was satisfactory, though this fog, it adds a certain mystery to your charming village." Nesper, smile wavered. "A mystery we'd gladly forego, but come inside, you'll be wanting rest." She led him into the inn, where oak-paneled walls and a fire's glow banished the chill. As they climbed the stairs to his room, she ventured, "What brings you to our corner of the world, Miss Poirot? We are not accustomed to such distinguished guests." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Madam, I seek only tranquility. The noise of London, it fatigues me. A friend, Captain Hastings, spoke of Wychwood as a place of peace, a refuge from the storm. And so here I am." Mrs. Fletcher nodded, though her expression grew distant. "It was peaceful once. Now," she left the thought unfinished, her gaze drifting to the mist beyond the window. Poirot's room was simple yet pristine estate. He approved with a nod. He unpacked with precision, arranging his possessions as though order itself might ward off the unease seeping through the village. From outside, a mournful waltz floated through the fog, its notes faint and haunting. Poirot paused, listening. The sound, so out of place, quickened his pulse. Later, in the parlor, Mrs. Fletcher served him a Tyson chamomile and mint. She said, "Good for the nerves." "Merely, madam," Poirot said, sipping delicately. "Now tell me." "The village whispers of an illness, it troubles you greatly." Her face shadowed. "Aye, it does. Fever, chills, breathlessness, it struck several in mere days. Dr. Hargrove made an infirmary of the village hall. Mr. Turner, husband to Emily Turner, is among the worst. A fine man, but he's fading fast." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "This Dr. Hargrove, he is capable, very," she said, "but even he's at a loss. It's come on so quick." Their talk was cut short by Mr. Henry Wilkins, the storekeeper, who barged in with a scowl. "Edith," he growled, "it's chaos at the hall. Stock's low, trade stalled. If this sickness spreads, they'll quarantine us." Poirot interjected, "I'm sure you fear more than illness alone." Wilkins glared. "I quarantine's bad for business, bad for all." He stormed off, muttering. Mrs. Fletcher sighed. "He's right to fret. We're on edge." As it is, dusk fell heavy, and Poirot retired to his room, the fog thick against the glass. The waltz played on ghostly in the silence. Then came a shout. A villager burst in below, frantic. "Mrs. Fletcher, Mr. Turner's worse. Dr. Hargrove says it's dire." Poirot straightened his mind. A light, the music ceased, swallowed by mist. Wychwood's charm had unraveled into dread, and Poirot knew his retreat was now a riddle to unravel. The first light of dawn had scarcely breached the fog when a tentative knock roused Hercule Poirot from his slumber. His rest had been fitful, disturbed by the distant strains of a gramophone waltz that had haunted the night. He rose with a fastidious air, smoothing his silk dressing gown and adjusting his mustache before opening the door of his room at the Rose and Crown. And Mrs. Edith Fletcher stood in the threshold, her face ashen, in her hands wringing a damp handkerchief. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice quivering. "It's dreadful news. Mr. Turner passed away in the night." Poirot's green eyes narrowed, though his demeanor remained unruffled. "Mourn, that is most unfortunate. My deepest sympathies, madam. He was, I take it, gravely ill." She replied, her breath catching. "But it's come so sudden, the village, we're all shaken. And there's talk of a contagion, like that terrible flu years back." Poirot inclined his head. "Fear it spreads faster than any malady, n'est-ce pas? But we must not leap to conclusions. What says Dr. Hargrove? He's beside himself, poor man," she said, "doing all he can at the infirmary. I'd best not keep you. Breakfast will be ready soon." As she retreated, Poirot closed the door, his mind already alight. Mr. Turner's death had plunged Wychwood Under Ashe into deeper unease, and he sensed the threads of a mystery beginning to weave. By midday the village was transformed. From his window, Poirot observed a somber procession. Men in dark overcoats arrived in motorcars, their voices hushed and clipped. They conferred with Constable Albert Barnes, whose boyish face strained to project authority as he adjusted his helmet nervously. Barriers sprang up at the village's edges, adorned with stark signs: quarantine, keep out. Supply carts and travelers were turned away, their protests swallowed by the fog. Poirot descended to the inn's parlor, where Mrs. Fletcher twisted her apron. "It's done." Then she murmured, "They've locked us in. No one enters, no one leaves, not till this sickness is understood." "Preciso," said his tone, even a prudent measure, though inconvenient. "And how will Wychwood fare?" "Madam, poorly," she admitted. "We need goods from outside, food, medicine. With Mr. Turner gone, and others falling ill." Her words faded into a sigh. Poirot offered a reassuring nod. "Order will prevail, madam. It always does." Stepping outside, he felt the quarantine's weight settle over the village like a shroud. The cobblestone lanes, once quaint, now lay desolate, their charm eclipsed by boarded windows and an oppressive silence. Only the occasional bark of a dog pierced the mist. Poirot's polished shoes tapped a steady rhythm as he ventured forth, his sharp gaze cataloging every detail. He passed the textile mill, its red brick bulk brooding beside the river. The chimney stood dormant, and the great wheel rested motionless. Poirot paused, his eyes drawn to the water surface, dark and languid, marred by an oily sheen that shimmered unnaturally. A faint bitter odor lingered, and he murmured, "Mercurio," tucking the observation into his mental ledger. His path led him to St. Mary's Church, its spire a gray sentinel against the fog. The doors stood ajar, and within voices rose in prayer. Slipping into a rear pew, Poirot watched Reverend Thomas Whitfield at the pulpit, his kindly face etched with weariness. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow," the Reverend, in his voice faltering, "how do we stand firm when shadows lengthen over us?" A ripple of unease passed through the small congregation, their heads bowed under the weight of fear. Poirot noted the tremor in Whitfield's hands, the doubt flickering in his eyes. A man of faith, wrestling with despair. As the service ended, villagers shuffled out, their whispers a low hum of anxiety. Mrs. Clara Benson approached, her lace shawl drawn tight, her eyes glinting with eagerness. "Mr. Poirot, the detective." "Yes, oui, madam," he replied, bowing slightly. She leaned in, her tone conspiratorial. "It's the mill, you mark me dumping filth into the river by night. That's what's brought this curse." Poirot's mustache twitched. "A serious charge, madam. You have seen this light's late hours," she said with a shrug. "Folk talk that rivers wrong anyone can see it." "Merci," Poirot said, his politeness masking skepticism. "I shall reflect on this." She departed, and Poirot stepped back into the fog, pondering the mill, the river, the sickness. Coincidence, or something more? At the Rose and Crown the air crackled with discord, voices clashed in the common room, and Poirot lingered in the doorway. Unseen villagers huddled around the bar, their tempers frayed. "It's Ashford's mill," a burly man bellowed, fist pounding the counter. "Poisoning us all." "Rubbish," snapped another. "It's a plague carried in outsiders. That's who outsiders, like Smith," a woman sneered, "skulking about up to no good." Poirot's interest piqued at the mention of John Smith, the enigmatic lodger. Before he could step forward, Mrs. Fletcher intervened, her voice steady enough. "Now, we'll not tear ourselves apart." The group dispersed grumbling, and Poirot withdrew, his thoughts churning. Fear had ignited suspicion, and beneath it simmered rivalries. Long buried night descended, the fog pressing thick against the inn's windows. Poirot sat by the fire at his warming, his hands the day's events swirling in his mind. He set his cup aside, resolve hardening. Tomorrow he would visit the infirmary. If answers lay hidden, they rested there amid the sick and the steadfast. Dr. Hargrove, his mustache quivered with anticipation. The confinement he sensed veiled more than illness, it cloaked a deeper enigma, one Hercule Poirot was determined to unravel. Hercule Poirot stepped into the village hall of Wychwood Under Ashe, now a makeshift infirmary. and paused, his sharp senses assaulted by the heavy scent of carbolic soap that hung in the air. The hall, once resonant with the laughter of village fats and the clinking of teacups, had been stripped of its former rows of iron beds, lined the walls, their occupants coughing feebly, the sound a mournful counterpoint to the silence beyond the fog-shrouded windows. The atmosphere pressed down upon him, somber and thick with an unspoken dread that seemed to permeate the very beams of the ancient structure. Nurse Margaret Jenkins moved among the patients with the brisk efficiency of a seasoned campaigner, her starched uniform rustling like the leaves outside. Her hands were steady as she adjusted a blanket or offered a sip of water, yet Poirot's keen eyes noted a tightness about her lips, a fleeting glance toward the doctor's annex that betrayed something beyond mere duty. She was a woman of competence, he mused, but perhaps not without her secrets. At the far end of the hall stood Dr. James Hargrove, his figure slightly stooped with the weight of sleepless nights, yet his voice retained a calm authority. As he murmured to a patient, his coat was creased, his eyes shadowed, but there was a resilience in his bearing that spoke of a man determined to hold the line against an invisible foe. Poirot approached, his polished shoes clicking softly on the wooden floor. Dr. Hargrove, he said, his tone formal, yet tinged with a courteous warmth. I am Hercule Poirot. I come not as a man of medicine, but one who seeks to understand. May I offer my assistance? The doctor looked up, a flicker of recognition crossing his weary features. Monsieur Poirot, he replied, his voice low but steady. Your name is known even here. Any aid you might lend would be a boon. This illness, it defies me. Fever, chills, a struggle for breath, like the influenza, yet it yields to no remedy. I know. Poirot nodded, his mustache quivering slightly as he absorbed the words. We doctor a stubborn malady. Indeed. Have you a theory, perhaps, as to its cause? Hargrove sighed, passing a hand across his brow. I have wondered if it be contagion or something in the air, perhaps the water, but I lack proof. Each day they weaken, and his voice faltered, and he turned his gaze to the rows of beds. Before Pooh could press further, Nurse Jenkins approached, her expression stern. Dr. Mrs. Carter's next dose. Shall it be the laudanum again? Hargrove's jaw tightened. No, Margaret will use the new tincture. The Lord fails to ease their lungs. Her eyes narrowed, a flash of defiance breaking her composure. That tincture isn't proven. Here, we might worsen. We worsen by doing nothing. Hargrove cut in, his tone sharp. Do as I say. Jenkins pressed her lips into a thin line, gave a curt nod, and retreated, her footsteps brisk with suppressed irritation. Poirot watched the exchange with interest, noting the strain beneath their words, a rift perhaps born of more than this moment. As the nurse withdrew, a frail figure emerged from the shadows, her steps unsteady, yet driven by a fierce purpose. Miss Emily Turner clutched a locket at her throat, her pale face a mask of grief, her eyes burning with accusation. As she faced Hargrove, she cried, her voice raw and trembling, you let him die, my husband, your treatments, your promises, all for naught. How dare you stand there as if you care? Hargrove flinched, his composure cracking. Miss Turner, I grieve with you. I did all I could, every remedy, every hour, all you could. She spat, her hands shaking. He trusted you, and now he's gone. Her voice broke, and she turned away, stifling a sob. Poirot stepped forward, his tone gentle yet firm. Madam, your sorrow, it is a heavy burden. Nesper, but the doctor, he battles with what tools he has. Let us not judge too hastily. She turned to him, her tear-streaked face softening for an instant. You don't know, she whispered. He was my world. With that she fled the hall, her locket glinting as she vanished into the gloom. Hargrove exhaled, his shoulders slumping. She's right to mourn, he murmured, but I swear I tried. Courage, mon ami, Poirot said, resting a hand briefly on his arm. Now perhaps your office, I would see where you wage this war. The doctor led him to a small annex, a cramped space cluttered with medical volumes and papers. Strewn across a desk, shelves bore vials labeled with dates and the word river, their contents catching Pooh's eye. The room was a study in disarray, at odds with Hargrove's precise manner, a sign, perhaps, of a mind stretched thin, interested. Poirot murmured, lifting a vial. You examine the river, doctor? Hargrove nodded. Yes, there's a strangeness to it, an odd sheen, a faint smell. I thought it might tie to the sickness, but I've not had time to pursue it. Poirot's gaze sharpened, a prudent thought. The river, it may whisper truths. We have yet to hear. A low groan from the hall interrupted them, a patient's cry cutting through the air. Hargrove winced, his fatigue stark. Poirot, ever watchful, saw dedication in the man, but also a fraying edge. I shall leave you to your duties, Dr. Poirot said, but I will return. There is much here to ponder. Hargrove managed a faint smile. Any time, Poirot, perhaps your intellect can pierce what my science cannot. Poirot stepped back into the fog-laden street. The carbolic scent clinging to his coat. The patient's groan lingered in his ears, a haunting note against the silence. He pondered the vials, the clash between the nurse and the doctor, Miss Turner's anguished fury. In this quarantined village, secrets festered as surely as the illness, and Hercule Poirot resolved to lay them bare. The scream tore through the stillness of dawn with the ferocity of a tempest, rending the fragile calm that had settled over Wychwood Under Ashe. Hercule Poirot roused from a light slumber at the Rose, and crowned and adjusted his dressing gown with a swift, precise motion, and hastened toward the village hall. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the frost-kissed cobblestones, their rhythm a counterpoint to the fog that lingered like a shroud over the sequestered village. Beside him hurried Constable Albert Barnes, his youthful countenance drained of color, his breath puffing in anxious clouds as he struggled to match Poirot's brisk pace. They reached the hall, its heavy oak doors ajar, and stepped into a scene thick with the antiseptic bite of carbolic soap, now undercut by a darker, more sinister scent. The iron tang of blood. Nurse Margaret Jenkins stood trembling in the doorway of the doctor's annex, her hands clasped tightly before her wide eyes fixed upon the horror within. Monsieur Poirot, she gasped, her voice a quaver of distress. It's Dr. Hargrove. It's too awful. Poirot brushed past her with a nod, his keen gaze sweeping the cramped office annex with the meticulous care of an artist studying a canvas. There lay Dr. James Hargrove, sprawled ignominiously upon the floor, his body twisted in the final agonies of death, and a surgical knife jutted from the nape of his neck, its blade sunk deep, and a crimson pool seeped into the Persian rug beneath him, its once intricate patterns now a grotesque mockery. The desk stood in chaos, papers strewn like autumn leaves, a drawer wrenched open, its contents rifled. Poirot's keen eyes noted a gap among the neatly labeled folders, a space where a file had been hastily removed. Nearby, a few loose pages bore the doctor's handwriting, scrolled notes on water samples and chemical analyses, but the comprehensive report, the damning evidence, was gone. His attention shifted to the window, flung wide to the chill morning air. Muddy footprints, large and distinct, traced a path from the sill to the desk and back again, their edges sharp with fresh earth and blades of grass. Poirot's mustache gave a faint twitch. Monsieur, he murmured, a strike of stealth delivered with malice. Constable Barnes lingered at his side, his hands fidgeting with his helmet. Sir, what do we do? I've never. His voice trailed into a helpless stammer. Poirot turned, his tone steady yet authoritative. Calm yourself, mon ami. First we secure this place. No one enters or departs without my word. Then we summon those who must answer for this deed. Barnes nodded, a flicker of relief softening his features as he hastened to obey. Poirot knelt beside the body, his movements deliberate, avoiding the blood's reach. The knife, he noted, was of surgical precision, likely pilored from the infirmary itself. The wound struck from behind bespoke a killer unseen by his victim. Hargrove's face, frozen in shock, bore no hint of recognition. Rising, Pooh's gaze lingered on the desk, his mind piecing together the significance of the missing file. Monsieur, he murmured, the thief has taken more than a life. He has stolen the truth itself. He straightened as Nurse Jenkins edged closer, her composure fraying. Mademoiselle Poirot, began his voice, gentle yet insistent, you discovered him. Thus recount to me all you saw. She swallowed, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. I came at dawn, as I do each morning, to check on him. The door was ajar. I pushed it open, and there he lay. I touched nothing, I swear. I only screamed and ran for help. Poirot inclined his head. And last night, did you hear a sound, perhaps, or glimpse a figure? Her brow creased, uncertainty clouding her gaze. I thought I heard footsteps late near midnight outside, and perhaps a shadow by the window. But I was weary. I cannot swear to it. Merely, Poirot said, his mind filing her words. Footsteps, a shadow, fragments to ponder. As Poirot and Constable Barnes emerged from the annex, a crowd had gathered outside the building, drawn by the clamor of Nurse Jenkins' scream and whispers of tragedy rippling through the quarantined village. Villagers clustered in anxious groups there. Murmurs, a low hum of dread among them. Stood the suspects, their distinct reactions cutting through the collective unease. Mr. Reginald Ashford stood rigid at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, his stern eyes fixed upon the annex door, a muscle pulsing in his jaw. His son Timothy paced nearby with restless energy, his fists clenching and unclenching As though itching for action, Miss Emily Turner clutched a handkerchief, her tearful gaze darting among the villagers, with accusation, her breath hitching. In quiet sobs, Nurse Jenkins lingered near the entrance, her nerves steadied by duty, though her eyes flitted uneasily. Mr. John Smith leaned against a nearby wall, his dark eyes watchful beneath his hat's brim, an air of cool detachment about him. Poirot cleared his throat, commanding their focus. Madame Mesher, a grave crime has struck this night. Dr. Hargrove is dead, murdered within these walls, and with him vital evidence has vanished in this lockdown. The killer cannot flee thus. He stands among us. Hercule Poirot shall uncover him. You will gather at the inn where I shall speak with each in turn. A murmur rippled through them. Mr. Ashford's voice cut sharp. Absurd. We are all prisoners here, and you point fingers at us. Timothy laid a hand on his arm. Father, peace. We must aid if we are to resolve this. Miss Turner's sob broke free. First my husband, now this. What curse plagues us? Mr. Smith's tone was smooth, enigmatic. A tragedy, yes, yet not wholly surprising. Poirot's eyes lingered on him, but he held his counsel. To Barnes he said, guard this place. Well, Manami, I shall return. As the villagers dispersed, their whispers a hum of fear, Poirot stepped into the fog-laden air, the mist curling about his feet. The quarantine had stretched Wychwood's nerves to now. Murder had snapped them. Adjusting his hat, he sifted the clues. The missing file, the prints, the shadow, his little gray cells alight. The killer lurked near, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until the truth emerged from this shadowed night. The parlor of the Rose and Crown and stood as a haven of order amid the turmoil that gripped Wychwood Under Ashe. The fire in the hearth cast a steady glow across the oak paneled walls, where chairs formed a neat semicircle. Hercule Poirot, his pinstriped suit pristine, set his Hamburg hat upon the mantel, and surveyed the room with eyes sharp as cut glass. In this village, where fear festered like a hidden wound, he would begin his methodical unraveling of Dr. Hargrove's murder. Mrs. Edith Fletcher lingered at the door, her keen gaze tempered by a hint of disco. Shall I fetch them now, Miss Poirot? She asked, her voice firm despite the morning strain. Oui, madam. Poirot replied, his tone polite yet resolute. Monsieur Reginald Ashford first, if you please. She inclined her head and departed, leaving Poirot to study the fog pressing against the mullioned windows, a mute shroud over the village's secrets. The confinement had tightened since the doctor's death, amplifying the whispers of dread. The murderer trapped within these bounds must be found, and Poirot's little gray cells were already at work. Mr. Reginald Ashford entered, his bearing as rigid as the mill he ruled. His gray eyes met Poirot with a glint of challenge as he took his seat. Well, M'sieu Poirot, he said, his voice clipped. What do you wish to discuss? Pooh tilted his head. Monsieur, the night of the murder, where were you? At home, Ashford replied, unwavering. In my study, reviewing accounts. The quarantine has tangled my affairs. Alone we pressed gently. Ashford's jaw tightened. My butler Jenkins attended me. He brought tea at 9 o'clock, and again at 11. Bon Poirot said, his tone smooth. And Jenkins, he would say the same, no doubt. Of course, Ashford said, though his fingers twitched faintly. He's reliable enough. Poirot's mustache curved. Curious. Tell me, monsieur, did Jenkins seem himself that night? Did he linger perhaps, or falter in his step? Ashford's brow creased. He may have paused. I suppose he's old. His hands shake at times. Precise him. Poirot murmured, his gaze piercing. A pause can speak volumes. And from your study you heard nothing, no sound beyond your walls? Nothing, Ashford insisted, his tone hardening. It was a still night. Trebang, Pooh said, rising. We shall speak again. Ashford left his stride stiff, and Poirot noted the flicker of unease, a crack in the mill owner's armor. Timothy Ashford burst in next, his restless energy crackling like the fire. He paced before settling, his dark hair tousled, his fists clenched. Make this quick, he snapped. Monsieur Timothy Poirot began. You were at the pub that night? Yes, Timothy said curtly, with the locals drinking. And you stayed late? Poirot asked, his voice mild. No, I left early, Timothy replied, his eyes darting to the hearth. Had business to settle. Our business? Poirot mused. What manner of business calls a man from his ale so soon? Timothy shifted. Estate matters. Nothing to do with his patre, Poirot said. But tell me, when did you leave? 10. Perhaps, Timothy muttered. Walk the grounds. After Poirot's eyes gleamed. The grounds are vast. Yet no one saw you return until much later. What kept you? I needed air. Timothy shot back, his defiance flaring. The quarantine, it's suffocating. Suffocating indeed, Poirot said, dismissing him with a nod. The young man's agitation hung in the air, a thread to tug. Miss Emily Turner glided in, her black dress, a shroud, her hands trembling around a locket. Poirot softened his approach. "Madam, you were alone that night?" "Yes," she whispered, her eyes damp. "In my cottage, grieving." "Pauvre Madame," Poirot said gently. "And no one called upon you?" "No," she murmured. "I was alone." Pooh leaned forward. "Yet a neighbor mentioned voices." "Two voices raised from your cottage. Were you perhaps speaking to your grief?" Her breath hitched, her grip tightening. I may have cried out alone. There was no one." Setcha said, his tone kind, yet firm. The neighbor was certain. Two distinct voices. "Are you sure?" "Madam, yes," she gasped, fleeing with a sob. Her distress was real, but Poirot sensed a veil over her words. Nurse Margaret Jenkins entered, her uniform starched, her thin face taut with fatigue. She sat stiffly, hands folded. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, "you worked all night tending patients?" "Yes," she replied, her voice clipped. "My log proves it. Rounds every hour." "Magnifique," Poirot said. "And every hour was recorded." She faltered, her gaze dropping. There was one I missed. It was hectic. Patients, failing supplies, short 1 hour." Poirot repeated, his tone probing. "And during that time, what did you hear?" "Perhaps outside." Her eyes flickered. "Footsteps? Maybe. I couldn't be sure. I was rushed." "Merci," Poirot said, noting her strain as she left duty. Wearied with something unspoken, Mr. John Smith strolled and lost his charm, a gleaming mask, his dark eyes glinting beneath his hat. He reclined with ease. "Mercure Smith," Poirot said, "you slept all night." "Like a stone," Smith replied, grinning. "This old inn's noisy, though we—" Poirot said the maid heard footsteps, clear steps on the stairs, not just creaks. "No," Smith's smile held. "She hears things. Old houses play tricks." "Tricks, perhaps," Poirot counted. "But she insists someone moved with purpose." "Were you truly asleep?" "Dead to the world," Smith said lightly. "A lockdown wears a man out." "A Dr. Hargrove?" Poirot asked. "You knew him?" "Barely," Smith said, shrugging. "A shame, his death." "A shame indeed," Poirot said, waving him off. The man's ease felt too practiced. Later, Poirot called on Mrs. Clara Benson, finding her propped in bed, her eyes alight with tales. "Madam, you saw something that night?" She said eagerly. "A figure, tall, cloaked, near the infirmary, skulking in the fog." "Monsieur," Poirot said, "and their face hidden?" She replied, "But they moved sly like a thief." "Mercy," Poirot said, pondering. "Her vivid account, fact or fancy?" At the infirmary he studied the muddy footprints, large, nicked fresh, and the rifled desk missing its letter. The mill's shadow loomed larger, a motive taking shape. Rain drummed the inn's windows as Poirot stood within the storm, echoing the village's unrest. Each conversation had yielded a fragment. Alibis teetered, secrets stirred. The killer was close, and his mind warred, assembling the mosaic. The fog that cloaked Wychwood Under Ashe had grown denser as the morning waned, its spectral wisps threading through the village lanes and coiling about the ancient cottages like a shroud woven by unseen hands. Hercule Poirot stood poised at the entrance of the Rose and Crown in his pinstriped suit, pristine. Despite the damp, his Hamburg had tilted just so. His sharp green eyes surveyed the muted world beyond, where the quarantine's weight pressed upon the villagers like a second mist, and the murder of Dr. James Hargrove had turned their quiet unease into a palpable dread. To Poirot, however, this oppressive air was a challenge, a tapestry of secrets begging to be unraveled by the deft fingers of his mind. With a purposeful step, he set forth to trace the threads of suspicion that wound through Wychwood's heart. His first task drew him to room 3, the unassuming quarters of Mr. John Smith, whose polished demeanor had failed to dispel the villagers' wary glances. With a nod from Mrs. Fletcher, the inn's shrewd proprietor, Poirot ascended the narrow staircase, its worn runner muffling the tap of his polished shoes. The door opened with a faint creak, revealing a chamber so orderly it seemed to mock the chaos. Beyond its walls the bed stood taut with military precision, the wardrobe's door sealed shut, and beneath the frame rested a suitcase, its leather scuffed, yet meticulously placed. Poirot knelt, his gloved hands undoing the clasps with care, and from within he drew a leather pouch that piqued his curiosity. Inside lay a sepia-toned photograph of a stern woman, her high-collared dress framing a gaze that pierced through the years. On its reverse and faded script ran the words, "To Edward with love." "Edward," Poirot murmured, his mustache giving a faint twitch. Was this John Smith's true name? Edward Langley? Perhaps the London embezzler whispered of in hushed tones. The woman might be his wife, a remnant of a life discarded. Yet how did this tie to Dr. Hargrove's fate? Poirot's mind turned swiftly. Had the doctor stumbled upon Smith's secret, it might suggest a motive, yet Hargrove's obsession Had been the illness the rivers, taint not the newcomers past Smith's alibi, was thin. He claimed to have slept soundly through the night, but the maid's tale of footsteps could point to any restless soul in this creaking inn, for now Poirot replaced the photograph with a sigh on their son's issue. He conceded a puzzle piece that refused to fit, though he filed it carefully among his thoughts. The staircase creaked anew as he descended to the parlor, where Mrs. Fletcher arranged a tray of chamomile, her keen eyes lifting to meet his with a flicker of concern. "Madam." Poirot began easing into a chair with his customary grace. "Tell me of Nurse Jenkins. She is loyal to Dr. Hargrove, who we Mrs. Fletcher poured the steaming brew, her hands steady, despite the day's burdens, loyal, as they come Sir been with him years, ever since he took her in after her trouble in London." Her voice dropped as though the walls themselves might listen. "She was at St. Mary's Hospital, let go, they say, for a mix-up with a patient's dose, a heavy thing, but Dr. Hargrove gave her a fresh start, believed in second chances. He did." Poirot's gaze sharpened as he sipped the tisane, its warmth a quiet comfort. "And he knew of this trouble, I'd wager." "He did," she replied, settling the teapot with a soft clink. "Once told me everyone's got a right to mend their ways. Margaret, Nurse Jenkins, she's clung to him like a shadow ever since." Interessant, Poirot mused, setting his cup aside. Harrow's forgiveness seemed to bind her loyalty tighter, rendering her an unlikely suspect. The thread of her past, though tangled, led not to murder, but to gratitude. He inclined his head in thanks, and took his leave, the fog greeting him once more as he stepped into the muted streets. The general store lay a short walk hence, its dim interior presided over by Mr. Henry Wilkins, whose gruff features bore the strain of the quarantines. "Toll, Mr. Wilkins," Poirot said, his tone measured yet probing. "You seem a man much troubled. Is it only this lockdown that darkens your brow?" Wilkins slammed a ledger shut, his snort cutting through the stillness. "That, and the mill Ashfords, fouling the river, dumping waste under cover of night, thinking us fools. That's what's sickening us, mark my words." Poirot's eyes narrowed, a gleam of interest sparking within. "You have witnessed this, we lights at the mill after dark, queer smells on the breeze." Wilkins growled, his fists tightening. "No proof solid enough for a court, mind, but it's no mere chance trait curio," Poirot said, storing the accusation like a card up his sleeve. The mill demanded his attention, and so he turned his steps toward the Ashford estate, where Mr. Reginald Ashford awaited in a study lined with stern portraits and ledgers. His impatience of palpable force. "Mercure Ashford," Poirot began, his voice smooth as polished stone, "there are tales that your mill poisons the river by night. What say you to this?" Ashford's face darkened, his hands clenching atop the desk, utter wrought idle, tongue-spinning lies. "My mill runs clean as the day it was built, yet the river it gleams strangely." Poirot countered, his gaze unrelenting. "And Dr. Hargrove, he studied its waters, did he not?" A flicker crossed Ashford's eyes, a crack in his steely facade. "The doctor was wrong-headed. No proof ties my mill to anything," Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. "But belief, sure, can stir a village to act." He withdrew, leaving Ashford's protests ringing hollow, when a sudden clamor of voices erupted from the mill office beyond. Poirot paused, his ears attuned to the sharp exchange. "You're too timid, father," came Timothy Ashford's voice, fierce and unrestrained. "We must expand quarantine, be damned, the future won't wait." "Foolish boy," Mr. Ashford shot back, "you'll drag us to ruin." Unseen in the fog, Poirot lingered, the young man's ambition a vivid stroke on the canvas of his suspicions. Timothy's boldness, strained by the seclusion, hinted at a ruthlessness worth watching. His path led next to the infirmary, where the muddy ground near the annex window yielded a prize, a scrap of dark cloth caught on a thorn bush. Poirot plucked it free, its coarse texture rough against his glove. "No, Petra," he murmured, recalling Mrs. Benson's account of a cloaked figure. This fragment lent weight to her words, a silent echo of the footprints he had traced as dusk settled over Wychwood. Poirot found himself by the riverbank. The waters sluggish flowed dark beneath an oily sheen that shimmered in the fading light. He crouched, filling a vial with the tainted liquid, its acrid scent a match for the samples in Hargrove's office. The illness clustered here, the doctor's notes pointed here, the mill's shadow fell here. "Slayer," he whispered, rising as the fog swirled about him. Hargrove had unearthed the river's poison, his missing file a threat to the Ashfords' legacy, a truth silenced by a killer's hand. The quarantine had cracked open the village's fears, and now by this sullied stream Poirot's suspicions crystallized. The sickness and the murder were entwined, and the culprit lurked close. Manger, he said softly, his eyes fixed on the Watt's gleam. "The little gray cells, they weave the pattern. True justice shall not sleep this night." The dusk settled heavily over Wychwood Under Ashe, its fading light swallowed by the fog that clung to the riverbank. Where Hercule Poirot stood, a small vial of tainted water cold against his gloved fingers. The river flowed dark and sluggish before him, its surface marred by an oily sheen that betrayed the poison within the mill's silent crime, as the realization of its link to the village's illness and Dr. Hargrove's murder crystallized in his mind. Poirot felt a stir of certainty, yet certainty alone was not enough. He needed evidence, something concrete, to tie the threads together. He lingered by the river, the vial in hand, his sharp eyes tracing the mill's silhouette through the mist. The Ashfords' legacy loomed there, stained by greed, and Poirot knew the infirmary held the key. With a murmured, "It is time to look again," he turned from the riverbank, his polished shoes tapping steadily on the cobblestones as he moved through the fog-draped village. The village hall's annex emerged from the mist, and Poirot slipped inside, the scent of carbolic soap sharp in the air. He bypassed the iron beds of the sick and entered Hargrove's cramped office. The desk remained as he'd last seen it, papers, scattered vials labeled River in the doctor's precise hand. Poirot sifted through the loose pages he'd noted earlier, those scrolled notes on water samples and chemical analyses, which had seemed fragmentary at the time. Now, with the river's secret laid bare, he examined them with fresh purpose. His fingers paused on a sheet half buried beneath a medical journal, its ink smudged as if written in haste. "Mill waste toxic levels detected, not influenza poisoning." The words stopped abruptly, a testament to Hargrove's interruption, likely by the murderer, who had taken the full report. Yet here, in these overlooked scraps, lay the doctor's dawning suspicion. Poirot's pulse quickened as he gathered the pages, their disjointed notes forming a mosaic of truth. His thoughts turned to the footprints beneath the annex window, large, distinct, their edges crisp with river mud. He recalled Timothy Ashford's boots, broad and worn, glimpsed during their earlier encounter. A visit to Mrs. Clara Benson might sharpen the focus further. Her cottage stood nearby, its curtains fluttering as she answered his knock, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Madam Benson," Poirot began, his tone smooth yet insistent. "The figure you saw, tell me again of his bearing." "Tall and broad, moved like a young man," she replied, her voice low with excitement. "He moved bold as brass, knowing the shadows. Now that you mention it, it could have been the young Ashford lurking there." "Mercy, madam," Poirot said, his mustache twitching faintly. "Your eyes, they see much." The pieces tightened around Timothy, his ambition a thread now plain to grasp. Returning to the riverbank as night deepened, Poirot stood with the vial and the notes. The fog had thickened, shrouding the mill, but his mind pierced it with precision. Hargrove had uncovered the contamination, a threat to the Ashfords' power, and Timothy had silenced him, taking the report, but missing these fragments. Murder and illness born of avarice gripped Wychwood, but Poirot would unravel them. He straightened his coat, his mustache quivering with resolve, and turned toward the Rose and Crown. And the time had come to summon the suspects, to reveal the river secret and the killer it hid. With each step through the mist, his certainty grew a light to banish the shadows and restore order to a village lost in darkness. The lockdown had cloaked Wychwood Under Ashe in an eerie stillness, its streets emptied and its people confined. Yet within the Rose and Crown, in a different tension brewed. Hercule Poirot, with his characteristic precision, had orchestrated the gathering of the suspects earlier that day. He had summoned Constable Albert Barnes to his side, his voice calm but resolute. "Mon ami, the quarantine leaves them no choice but to comply. Escort them here, Mr. Ashford, his son Timothy, Mademoiselle Turner, Nurse Jenkins, and Monsieur Smith. The truth awaits us at the inn." Barnes, ever beautiful, had set out, his heavy tread echoing through the fog as he gathered each suspect and led them to the Rose and Crown. Now they sat assembled in the inn's dining room, a reluctant audience to Poirot's unraveling of the mystery. The long oak table gleamed dully beneath the candelabras, flickering light casting restless shadows across their masked faces. Mr. Reginald Ashford sat rigidly, his stern eyes locked on Poirot. "Madame Zesher," Poirot intoned, his voice a calm thread in the taut silence. "We are here not for idle talk, but to unveil a deed most sinister. Dr. Hargrove's death was no accident. It was a calculated act to bury a secret too dangerous to live." The company shifted uneasily beneath their masks, worn ostensibly against the contagion. Mr. Reginald Ashford sat rigid, his stern jaw clenched beneath his cloth, covering Timothy. Ashford fidgeted beside him, his youthful energy restless, his hands concealed beneath the table. Miss Emily Turner clutched her locket, her breathing uneven, her gaze flitting nervously. Nurse Margaret Jenkins maintained a stiff composure, her uniform pristine, despite the faint tremble in her hands. Mr. John Smith reclined with a casual air, his dark eyes keen, a subtle smile lurking beneath his mask. Poirot's gaze swept over them, piercing and deliberate. First, we address Mr. Smith, the photograph in your possession. It reveals you as someone else, a man with a hidden past, Nespa. Yet I say to you, this does not make you the killer. Your motives, they do not align with this crime. Hargrove's death gains you nothing. I shall preserve your anonymity, and your true name remains with me alone. Smith inclined his head, his smile broadening faintly. A courteous act, Morrow. I thank you for it. Poirot nodded briefly before continuing. Next. Mademoiselle Jenkins, the gap in your logs raised suspicion. But I see now it was born of exhaustion, not deceit. Your loyalty to Dr. Hargrove shines clear, and no motive taints your actions. You are innocent. Jenkins released a quiet breath, her hands steadying. Thank you, sir. I only ever meant to serve him well. Pooh's tone sharpened as he pressed forward. Now we turn to Mademoiselle Turner. The voices your neighbor heard, they betray a visitor, do they not? You confessed to me that Timothy Ashford came to you seeking your aid against Hargrove. You refused him, and in that refusal we glimpse his desperation. Emily's fingers tightened on her locket, her voice a whisper. He was frantic. I couldn't help him. Poirot's attention shifted, his eyes locking onto the Ashfords. And so we arrive at the heart of this darkness. The river, its waters poisoned not by plague, but by the mill's hand. Dr. Hargrove knew this, and his letter was a call for justice. He produced a vial of murky river water. Holding it aloft, the mill's greed bled into these currents. Hargrove's discovery threatened ruin, and so he was silenced. Reginald Ashford's knuckles whitened on the table's edge. This is slander. You've no proof. Au contraire. Poirot counted, his gaze piercing. Hargrove's report and samples condemn you, and the footprints, they point to one among us. He turned to Timothy. Your boots, Mr. Timothy, carry the riverbanks marked. Madame Benson saw you near the infirmary that night. Timothy scoffed. She's a nosy old bat. Poirot's tone grew relentless. The pub's witnesses saw you leave early. Hargrove's note sight by the mill's sleeve. The net tightens. Reginald surged to his feet. You'll not slander my son. But Poirot's eyes locked on Timothy. Hargrove's report threatened your legacy. You killed to bury it. Timothy's resolve crumbled, his voice a ragged whisper. It was all falling apart. The mill, our name, Hargrove, would have destroyed us. The room seemed to still as Poirot's words settled. Greed, mon ami, it clouds the mind, but justice it sees all. Constable Barnes approached, his face set with resolve. Timothy Ashford, you're under arrest. As Timothy was escorted away, the dining room's tension eased, the air lighter with his confession. Poirot accepted a tisan from Mrs. Fletcher, her hand steady. Now a heavy truth, madam, but Wychwood will heal. She offered a small, grateful smile. You freed us, Miss Poirot. We're in your debt. He sipped his mustache, quirking faintly. Simon, devoir, madam. The little gray cells, they bring order from chaos. The morning sun, a pale disk struggling to pierce the remnants of fog, cast a tentative glow over Wychwood Under Ashe. The village, so recently entombed in silence and suspicion, stirred with the first whispers of renewal. Hercule Poirot stood at the window of his modest room at the Rose and Crown, in his sharp green eyes, surveying the scene below. The cobblestone lanes, once desolate, now bore the faint imprints of life. Returning here, a child darted across the green. Their shopkeeper swept his stoop with renewed vigor. The quarantine, that suffocating shroud, had lifted at last, banished by the light of truth. Poirot turned from the window, his movements precise, as he folded his silk pajamas and placed them into his leather suitcase. The room, though simple, had served him well, its order a small comfort amid the chaos of the past days. A soft knock interrupted his task, and he called out, "Entree." The door creaked open, and Mrs. Edith Fletcher entered, bearing a tray with a steaming pot of tisane and a single porcelain cup. Her face, lined with the strain of recent events, softened into a smile as she set the tray upon the small table. "Your last cup before you depart, Miss Poirot," she said, her voice warm but tinged with a melancholy that spoke of farewells. "Mercy, madam," Poirot replied, inclining his head. He accepted the cup, its warmth seeping into his fingers as he inhaled the fragrant steam. It has been Mondu, a most eventful stay. Mrs. Fletcher nodded her hands, smoothing her apron. We are deeply grateful for all you've done, sir. The village, it's already feeling lighter, now that the truth is out. The infirmary is nearly empty, and the mill, well, it's under new scrutiny, I hear. Poirot sipped the Zan, savoring its delicate blend of herbs with the human spirit. It is resilient. Nesper Wychwood will mend, though the scars of greed may linger a while yet. They spoke briefly of the village's recovery, the patients freed from the grip of poison, regaining strength. The mill, now pledged to reform under watchful eyes. Timothy Ashford awaiting trial for his crimes. Poirot listened, his mustache twitching faintly as he absorbed the details, his mind ever cataloguing, ever precise. And what of you, Monsieur Poirot? Mrs. Fletcher asked, her tone gentle. Will you return to London directly? We, madam, he replied, setting his cup aside. My holiday, it was not the rest I envisioned, but the little gray cells. They have had their exercise, and that perhaps is satisfaction enough. With his packing complete, Poirot donned his Berg hat and overcoat, adjusting the brim with meticulous care. He descended the stairs, his polished shoes tapping a steady rhythm, and stepped into the inn's parlor, where the fire crackled softly. A final farewell. Mrs. Fletcher awaited him, her hands clasped before her. Safe travel, sir, and thank you again. He bowed slightly, his eyes twinkling. Cien devoir, madam. Order must prevail, even in the most unexpected of places. Outside, the village unfolded before him, its lanes now touched by the tentative bustle of renewal. Poirot walked slowly, his gaze taking in the signs of life. Restored, the baker's oven belched, smoked, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the crisp air. Children laughed as they chased a stray dog across the green. The mill's great wheel turned once more, its rhythm a promise of industry, tempered by newfound caution. At the edge of the village, his hired Morris aide awaited, its engine purring softly. Poirot paused, casting a final glance back at Wychwood Under Ashe. The fog had lifted, revealing the gentle hills beyond, their autumnal hues a tapestry of gold and crimson. Manger, he murmured, his mustache quivering with a faint smile. What a holiday this has been! Not the rest I sought, but, said Levi, the unexpected, it sharpens the mind. He stepped into the car, the leather seat creaking beneath him as the village faded into the distance. Poirot allowed himself a moment of reflection. The case had been a tangle of greed and desperation, but justice had prevailed as it must, and though his nerves had found little repose, his intellect had thrived, his little gray cells triumphant once more. With a final nod to the receding spire of St. Mary's Church, Poirot turned his thoughts to London, where order awaited his return. The car sped on, carrying him away from Wychwood Under Ashe. Its shadows lifted, its peace tentatively restored. The fog over Wychwood Under Ashe parts at last, revealing the brilliance of Hercule's little gray cells. The mysterious illness that gripped the village was no contagion, but a poison seeping from the mill's tainted river. Lead and mercury, a legacy of greed uncovered by Dr. Hargrove. His murder, a desperate act to silence the truth, led Poirot to Timothy Ashford, the ambitious son whose blade struck to protect his family's name. With the killer unmasked and the quarantine lifted, the village stirs back to life, its peace hard won through justice. We hope this journey through suspicion and revelation has enthralled